Hello everybody, my name is Mardanov from College of Business and Computing, Southeast Missouri State University. My presentation topic is Determinants of FDI, Foreign Direct Investment in Developing and Developed Nations. Introduction. Why can developing countries not become developed nations? I always ask this question. Many other people ask and do research. International institutions agitate investing in developing nations without addressing the investment climate there. Private companies are investors and will make their own decisions. They make their analysis, country assessment, and most of them avoid risky developing countries. In this table, you see two groups of countries differing in the size of per capita GDP. The listed developing countries are way behind. These developing countries must do much work to become developed nations. It may take many decades. Research questions. What factors contribute to the country's FDI attractiveness? I assume that industrial infrastructure, the number of population, economic potential, trade balance, and labor will be the main determinants of FDI. I generated these factors through principal component analysis. Industrial infrastructure is the key. Without sufficient energy, no company will invest in a foreign country. Also, communication and transportation systems must be adequate and functional. The consumer base is essential. The larger the country's population, the better. The purchasing power of consumer is also essential. The trade balance indicates the country's direction. If the country is being industrialized, the trade balance is positive. If it is not industrialized, the trade balance is negative. China's trade balance is positive and it is industrializing itself. The low cost and educated labor is an important factor that China has, and some countries have. Country institutions are the key to creating good conditions for FDI and investment. Developed countries are still attractive for FDI in particular industries. In this table, we see institutional differences between developed and developing countries. If property rights are protected, people use their talent freely and create prosperity for themselves and the nation. Property rights are the core factor that makes the country a developed nation. Law and order help protect property rights. Judicial effectiveness must be real. Government integrity must be high. Corruption makes the country waste a lot of resources and effort to develop. Trade freedom is all right. However, it is not enough. Investment freedom in developing countries is poor. People cannot put their money into the development of the country. Oligarchs own or control governments. If you do not have access to credit and cannot use your money on your own, you do not have any incentives to do business. The numbers of business freedom are so good, but that is not enough. Theoretical framework literature. The core in FDI research is OLI paradigm. My research fits into the locational advantages aspect. Any country factors impact FDI attractiveness. The question is, which ones are statistically significant and consequential? You see a lot of determinants of FDI in this list. I can continue expanding this list. The following variables, industrial infrastructure, the population size, economic potential, trade balance, labor, can be key determinants of FDI attractiveness in cause-effect relations using institutions as instrumental variables. These variables were generated through factor analysis. Data sources are the World Bank's open access database, the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index, the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Index, Freedom House's Political Freedom Index. The year is 2019. Sample countries: developing and developed, 118 developing and 44 developed nations. Dependent variable is FDI inflows. Independent variables, as I said, those are industrial infrastructure, population, economy, trade balance, and labor resources. Instrumental variables, institutions, ease of doing business, tax burden, financial health, economic growth rates, political institutions, and economic institutions. Statistical techniques, instrumental variables estimation, multiple regression, and factor analysis. Results. I used 3 samples. One is a combined of developed and developing countries. The second is developed countries sample, and the third is developing countries sample. In simple words, we need independent variables which are exogenous to the dependent variable. That is, independent variables do not correlate with the model's error term. In the sample, there are 2 endogenous variables. However, the significance levels are not high. The test for over-identification did not reveal excessive instruments, so instrumental variables are suitable for 2SLS testing 2-stage least squares. GDP, market size, and trade balance are significant in the 2SLS estimation. The trade balance has a negative sign, however. OLS estimation results show that infrastructure, population, GDP, and trade balance are significant determinants of FDI. In OLS, the impact of institutions come from tax burden, economic freedom, and the ease of doing business. We have 3 exogenous and 2 endogenous factors in the combined sample, indicating that instrumental variables impact independent variables significantly. In the developed nations, the economy is endogenous at P equals 0.07. All others are exogenous. No independent variable is over-identified. That is, the instrumental variables work well. In 2SLS, only GDP is the main determinant of FDI in developed nations. In OLS, population, GDP, and trade balance negative are significant. In the sample of developed nations, we have 4 exogenous variables. The independent variables do not correlate with the error terms of the model. In developing nations, almost all the independent variables are endogenous. There is a correlation between these variables and the model's error term, which is undesirable for precise estimation. However, the instrumental variables were suitable for these independent variables because they were not excessive. In 2SLS estimation, no one independent variable is significant. Instrumental variable estimation did not work for the sample of developing nations. In OLS, 4 independent variables are significant. However, no institutional instrumental variables were involved. Only labor was insignificant. In the sample of developing countries, we have one exogenous variable, which is labor. All are endogenous, indicating that the instrumental variable do not influence independent variables while affecting FDI inflows. Discussion. Data play well with the combined sample and developed nations sample, not with developing countries sample. Their institutions are weak. They are not instruments for the country's economic development. Results of testing hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. Industrial infrastructure is not an FDI determinant in 2SLS estimation for all the samples. H1 is not supported in this case. Hypothesis 1 is supported in OLS estimation for the combined sample and the sample of developing nations. Not all countries have good infrastructure. Therefore, these nations must pay close attention to infrastructure building to be attractive. H2. The effect of population on FDI is not supported in 2SLS testing but supported in OLS estimation for all 3 samples. Hypothesis 3. The impact of economic potential is supported in 2SLS testing for the combined and developed countries samples and not supported in the sample of developing nations. In the OLS, hypothesis 3 is supported in all the samples. The trade balance is a determinant of FDI in the combined sample, but not the sample of developing and developed nations in the 2SLS estimation. It's negative. Hypothesis 4 is supported in all the samples in OLS testing. The trade balance has a negative impact on FDI in the combined sample and the developed nations sample. Hypothesis 5 is not supported by both estimations. The hourly wage score is the measure of labor in my study. I should have used some other measures of labor. The limitations. The limitation is that I focused on one main determinant only, location. Another limitation is measurement problems of labor. It may be a significant factor if measured correctly. Conclusion. My focus was on developing nations to find ways to help them grow faster. In 2SLS estimation, no instrumental variables or institutions were significant in the sample of developing nations. They have very weak institutions. These countries must conduct institutional reforms, eliminating corruption and expanding political and economic freedoms substantially. In developed countries, the 2SLS estimation works, indicating that their institutions actively facilitate economic development. Thank you very much for your attention.